L'Afrique compte plus de 52 pays. Pourquoi ne pas prendre le temps d'aller visiter d'autres pays? Donc, si vous voulez voyager cet été, ou bien dans les prochains jours, dans les prochains mois, privilégiez un autre pays d'Afrique que le vôtre.
Travel, show a lot of people places that they don't know exist in Africa. Africa has been underserved a lot, generally worldwide.
I started Traveling Truth because I wanted to share all the different things that I learned and continue to learn within Africa and also the diaspora. I wanted to create this platform to share the Africa that I experienced, but also share things to do and also travel tips in each country.
Visit Africa, travel in Africa, discover Africa. This has become a mantra for a lot of content creators and travel bloggers from Africa and the diaspora. As Africans and Afro-descendants, we are often urged to discover our rich and diverse continent, to get acquainted with its sceneries, its food and cultures, and to contribute to showing a different side of it. It's a beautiful and noble project, except for one thing. Traveling on the African continent when you're actually African with an African passport, it's everything but easy. In this very first episode of Beyond the Noise, we tell you exactly why and we dig in. But first, just like they do on every YouTube channel out there, I urge you to subscribe to Beyond the Noise Africa's YouTube channel. If you're interested in this kind of content, this is the place to be, so subscribe right now. To travel on the continent, you have three obvious options: the road, the tracks, or the air. For economic and practical reasons, road transportation comes first in Africa. It accounts for 80% of freight traffic and 90% of passenger traffic. However, road density remains very low. It's about 7 km per 100 square kilometer, and 40% of roads are in poor condition. It is therefore quite challenging to travel by road, and even more so if you're going from, say, Senegal in West Africa to Mozambique all the way towards the southeastern region. Now, as far as rail travel is concerned, Africa is also lagging behind the rest of the world. The African rail network is estimated at about 75,000 kilometers over a surface area of 30.2 million square kilometers, for a population of about 1.5 million inhabitants. That is way below the world average. According to a study published by researcher Malik Sane in 2017, most railway lines date back to the colonial era and have not been renewed, while some 20 African countries have no network today. Ultimately, air transportation remains the safest, fastest, and most efficient way. But on a continent where the minimum wage varies between $390 in the Seychelles and about $50 in Mauritania, for example, this is a method of travel that is far from accessible to the majority. Not to mention that air travel in Africa is particularly expensive. It's quite simple. If I want to book a return ticket from Abidjan to Niamey, I will have to pay a minimum of $924. $924 for an outward journey of 1,134 kilometers, which takes an average of 2 hours to complete. Whereas for a return trip to Paris, located about 4,879 kilometers from Abidjan, on a completely different continent, I would have to pay $468 on average. So the price is practically divided by 2 for a distance that is more than 4 times greater. Doesn't seem very logical, does it? Well, I agree. But what may seem like an anomaly is quite commonplace on the African continent, where flying today remains a luxury. Now, one of the causes of these high prices is the high cost of fuel, which has increased with the war in Ukraine. Just to put things in perspective, fuel used to represent between 20 to 25% of the cost base of most African airlines before the crisis. Today, it can account for up to half, if not more, and it constitutes their biggest expense item. African airlines are particularly vulnerable because they mostly rely on imported jet fuel. That is correct. Even oil-producing countries like Angola and Nigeria do not have local refineries that are able to process this type of fuel. As a result, jet fuel has to be imported, then transported by ship, then taken from ports to inland storage depots and airports, which are often located far from the coast. In some landlocked countries, for example, it is transported by rail, pipeline, or by road. In short, logistical issues make matters worse. But beyond the jet fuel, airlines have blamed the high operational costs and overtaxation that is at play on the continent. Nowel Ngala, private Pan-African airline Asky's commercial and operations director, has long advocated for these arbitrary fees to be reduced.
Are levied to generate income, and charges are put in place to pay for a service. If you look at the 4 regions in Africa, North, South, East, West, we have a total of over 200 different taxes. So we have things like stamp duties, airport depression tax, infrastructure tax, safety tax, airport service charges, immigration tax, and so on. There are just so many. When you refer to a tax like infrastructure tax and you come again and put equipment tax, it still means the same thing. Some of these taxes can also just be eliminated. The aviation industry is a well-organized industry. So governments find it very easy to tax it in order to do recoveries for their debt payments. The bad thing is the monies that are collected are not reinvested. That is why we still continue to have poor infrastructure in terms of lack of equipment, even manpower. Now, in some cases within the region, you have regional blocks that will come up with a kind of unified system requesting countries and governments to use. But all they can do is propose.
This was one of the objectives of the African Union's Single African Air Transport Market that was launched in 2018, whose main objective was to fully implement the Yamoussoukro Declaration of 1999. This goes to show that this is an outstanding and long-standing issue. So far, 34 African countries have adhered to the Single Market Treaty, which represents 80% of the African aviation network today. But in reality, there is no binding mechanism imposed on member states, as Romuald T, a journalist specialized in the aviation industry and the founder of the francophone magazine Ngueyap, tells us.
Les États pris individuellement mettent encore un fort accent sur le protectionnisme. D'après eux, en fait, ce protectionnisme, pour la plupart, serait un moyen, un levier utilisé pour protéger en fait leur compagnie nationale étatique contre la concurrence extérieure. Mais là encore, la preuve a montré qu'au cours de ces 20 dernières années, en fait, ça n'a pas été une solution. On a assisté à une faillite continue et qui va se répéter dans le long terme de toutes ces compagnies aériennes, qui se multiplient sur le continent.
Admittedly, the list of national companies that have gone bankrupt is very long. Air Congo, Air Gabon, Ghana Airways, Air Ivoire, Nigerian Airways, Air Senegal, Air Somali, and many, many more have vanished in the last 15 years. In short, African states are overtaxing private airlines in the hope of protecting their national carriers, but above all, to create revenue. And this without any regional or continental organization or even a treaty being able to sanction them, at least for now. The bottom line is that from one region to another on the same continent, taxes differ and so do ticket prices, as Nowel Ngala tells us.
Even within Africa, when you do a comparison within the regions, you see that in the northern part of Africa, this is where you find the lowest in terms of taxes, fee, and charges. Then you have the South African region. And it just explains why these are the regions that you have more airlines, and you have more airlines that are even able to do or have a business model as low-cost carriers.
Indeed, there are very few low-cost carriers in Africa, and most of them are located and headquartered in the northern and southern parts of the continent. Now, South Africa's Fly SA Fair is a relatively young low-cost carrier, which is one of the fastest growing in Africa, with a fleet of over 20 aircrafts. Other smaller carriers include Kulula.com, Fly Egypt, Jambo Jet, Air Arabia Maroc, and Fly 540, which have less than 10 aircrafts in their respective fleets, according to planespotters.net. Finally, FastJet, Air Arabia Egypt, Mango Airlines, Lyft, and Green Airways or have less than 6 aircrafts at their disposal. But this business model simply does not exist in the French-speaking countries of West and Central Africa, which tells you that these are the regions that are the most expensive to operate in. Finally, traveling in Africa when you are African is also complicated because sometimes, or rather often, you need a visa. If the single market or the African passport projects aspire in the long run for visa exemptions within the continent, not all regions or nations seem to want the system to change. According to the African Development Bank and African Union Commission's Africa Visa Openness Index report, 93% of African countries have maintained or improved their score compared to 2021. In other words, 2/3 of African countries have adopted more liberal visa policies than they did 6 years ago. But as the saying goes, the devil is in the detail. And when you zoom in, well, you realize that only 27% of the countries on the African continent do not require visas from other Africans. The reality is that many African passports are not just undesirable outside of the continent, they're also undesirable here. It is evidently easier to travel freely in Africa when you come from elsewhere, especially from Western countries. Therefore, the idea of an integrated and united African continent remains a myth, or at the very least, wishful thinking at this stage, as Romuald Ngueyap tells us.
Le Mozambique, à l'issue d'un conseil des ministres, décidait de l'exemption des visas pour 28 pays. Mais de ces 28 pays, en fait, il n'y a que 3 pays africains qui y figurent. J'ai nommé le Ghana, le Sénégal et la Côte d'Ivoire. Et la raison évoquée, c'est ça qui est curieux. Ils disent ces pays sont en fait des pays à faible risque d'immigration. Après, ce sont des pays d'Amérique, des pays d'Europe et des pays d'Asie. Mais si on veut aller vers une intégration africaine, évidemment, on aurait fait faveur et priorité à ces pays africains-là.
According to the World Tourism Organization, 67 million international tourists visited Africa in 2018, bringing in a total revenue of $38 billion. And all the projects like the African Continental Free Trade Area aim to implement the single market along with free movements of goods and people in Africa. Well, there's still a long way to go for Africans to be an integral part of the tourism industry on their own continent.